So we're going to get started. It's really great to see all of you here tonight. Thanks for coming out and joining us. My name is Jessica Dillon. I'm Associate Professor of Global Studies and Anthropology at the New School in New York and a member of the Worker Cooperative here at Making World. So welcome to the Bookstore and Social Center. It's good to have you all here. Just a couple of logistical reminders. Please keep your mask on for the duration of the event. The bathroom is just behind, right on that blue wall at the back. If you need it, and if you want to browse our book collection, we'll give you a little bit of time at the end of the event to look around, and we are live streaming it. So those are the logistical pieces of it. And just a little bit about the bookstore for those of you who are new, and those of you who are watching over live stream if you haven't been in the bookstore yet. Making World is a non-profit cooperative bookstore and social center that promotes collective knowledge, skills, and visions of liberation for our communities by distributing literature and other resources, as well as fostering a vibrant cultural programming space. We aim to strengthen grassroots organizing for people to care and support each other and make worlds of liberation possible. Through diverse political and cultural education initiatives, we promote learning from each other and the intersecting histories and futures of community organizing and movement building of Indigenous, Black, and Brown people and others resisting oppression worldwide. So one of the most important aspects of the work we're attempting to undertake in this space is to promote and foster a deep commitment to internationalism that is anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, and informed by anti-racist and Indigenous feminism, and a deep commitment to global solidarity. And I'm sure if you're coming to the event tonight, you know that we're living in a moment of immense environmental catastrophe and devastation. So global solidarity matters more than ever in this moment. The sixth assessment report on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released in August 2021, reveals a great picture of our current climate reality and forecast for what lies ahead, reminding us that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years, with a near linear relationship between cumulative anthropogenic CO2 emissions and the global warming they cause. This means that we are no longer waiting for the arrival of climate change. It is here. It lives in the stifling hot air we breathe during unanticipated heat waves. It's the reason droughts are becoming more severe, and at the same time, flooding is driving millions of people's lives into chaos, precariousness, and displacement. It explains why Arctic ice has reached its lowest level since at least 1850. Ocean acidification exists because of it, and it is the driver behind environmental conditions that are expected to produce 200 million climate migrants over the next 30 years. We don't need more evidence. The science could not be more crystal clear. So needless to say, we're excited to be hosting this event this evening on energy, democracy, and ecological transition. In terms of the format, we're going to hear from each of our speakers for about 7 to 10 minutes, and then they'll have a short discussion amongst themselves before we open it up for Q&A and larger group discussion. And I'll be introducing each of the speakers before they offer their remarks. So let's get started. So Ashley, you're going to speak first, so I'll introduce you now. So Ashley Dawson is Professor of Post-Colonial Studies in the English Department at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and the College of Staten Island. His latest books include People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons, Extreme Cities, The Peril and Promise of Urban Life in the Age of Climate Change and Extinction, A Radical History. A member of the Social Text Collective and the founder of the CUNY Climate Action Lab, he's a longtime climate justice activist. Welcome, Ashley.
Thanks so much, Jessica. And thank you to the bookstore and the collective for hosting us. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you all for coming out. So I'm going to make brief comments about the nub of the problem, and that is energy and how we generate energy. There are other sectors that need to be transformed, including transportation and the heating and cooling of buildings, but how we generate energy really is one of the main reasons for the climate crisis and for carbon emissions. So it's one of the things that we absolutely have to tackle head on. I'm going to be sort of doing a report back from struggles in New York City to really ground what I'm talking about. But there are two major takeaways that I want you to kind of keep in mind as underlying everything that I'm going to say. One of those is that we need to say a strong no to fossil capitalism and come up with powerful and dynamic new strategies coming out of the pandemic to block new fossil infrastructure. But we also need a potent yes. We need a potent set of alternatives to the existing fossil fuel system. And so we need to fight on two fronts. We need a kind of scissor action, both a strong no and a strong yes. So that's the one basic point. And the other point is that as we fight for some alternative, it's not just a kind of wonky question, not some abstract policy question, not some question about technology, not some question about finance. It's about how we conceptualize energy and who it benefits. Right now, energy in the United States benefits the rich and tends to victimize the poor and people of color. And we need to change that, right? So we have to have a fight for different infrastructures, but it has to be guided by a different idea of what energy could be and how it could benefit us all. In fact, how it belongs to us all, how it, in fact, is a kind of commons. And that's what I argue in more detail in my book, People's Power. The subtitle is Reclaiming the Energy Commons. So I'll talk a little bit about energy commons in the course of what I'm going to say. All right, so what's going on in New York? Well, as you may know, New York State successfully banned fracking a number of years ago. Yes, huge victory. But unfortunately, we consume a lot of fracked gas. And so there are huge struggles against pipelines, many of which come from Yoel's neck of the woods and end up going to New York City. So we have a lot of blockadia struggles. And often those pipelines are going through communities of color, right? So historical examples of environmental justice are being reiterated and deepened by the way that fossil infrastructure is being built out in New York City and New York State today. So there's a really important struggle going on right now in North Brooklyn against a fracked gas pipeline that's being built, and it's going through majority community of color neighborhoods like Greenpoint and Williamsburg. And the struggle there is really powerful because folks are articulating the terms of the struggle around very strong decolonial ideas, right? So people in these neighborhoods are from places like the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, and ancestrally, and they know that their history has to do with colonial violence, with U.S. imperial-backed military juntas and other forms of oppression. And so when a company like National Grid is trying to put a pipeline through a community like this, that whole history of colonial fossil infrastructure and oppression is brought up once again. And so the terms that they're fighting these pipelines in are extremely decolonial and consequently ripe for making powerful connections between other struggles against fossil infrastructure taking place in other countries, but also within the US. And so I know you're going to be talking about line 3, right? And so the kind of iconography, the images and some of the posters in the frack out of Brooklyn, the struggle against the pipeline in North Brooklyn, very much connect up with the images in the fights against line 3 and against the pipeline in Standing Rock. So the image of the black snake, for instance, is prominently used by a lot of activists in the North Brooklyn struggle. Now, that struggle is ongoing. It has not yet been won, but we did have really important victories just recently, I'm very happy to say, against efforts to build a new frack gas power plant in Astoria. The NRG company was going to build a new gas power plant, and then also upstate, Danskamer was successfully, the governor and the Department of Environmental Conservation refused to grant a permit for those 2 power plants to move forward. So those are huge, huge victories, and they come as a result of community mobilizations against tremendous odds, against these huge multinational fossil fuel companies. And when one looks at the context in New York, it's even more important because our nuclear power plant recently went offline. Indian Point, which is about 10 miles north of New York City, the second reactor there was shut down last spring, which is a good thing. Obviously, the power plant has been leaking nuclear radiation into the surrounding groundwater, and it's right on the edge of the Hudson River. So, and it's way past its retirement date. So it was a huge victory for people and for the environment to have that shut down. The problem, though, is that the power plant produced 25% of New York City's energy supply. So we're suddenly faced with this huge lag or shortfall in energy supplies for the city. And that's why there's so much of a push to build out these frack gas power plants and to get more frack gas from the Marcellus Shale, essentially. It's not purely a result of lack of capacity, though, or rather the lack of capacity is as a result of the failure to build out renewable energy infrastructure, right? There's been what is often seen as a kind of landmark program that was started under Governor Cuomo called Revising the Energy Vision, which was supposed to transition us to renewable energy. But the amount of clean power that we have in the city and around the state is really minuscule, right? There's less than 1% solar in New York City, for instance, despite the fact that we've got all these rooftops that could have solar on them. There's still a very small amount of wind power off the coast of the city. In fact, the latest proposal is to power all of our municipal buildings with clean power that's brought down from Quebec in a scheme that has been backed by BlackRock, which you may be familiar with as one of the major hedge funds, which has been investing in soya in the Amazon and bulldozing the rainforest. But nonetheless, they have a kind of green investment swing, and they've been backing this scheme to bring clean power down from Quebec, which is hugely problematic because a lot of that power comes from First Nations lands. So creating dams and supposedly clean hydropower involves, continuation of colonial and racist forms of dispossession. And it's also hugely problematic environmentally because the transmission pipeline is supposed to come down the Hudson, which is the nation's largest Superfund site. There's a lot of really toxic industrial waste on the riverbed of the Hudson, which is kind of settled because it was all produced about half a century ago. If you put a pipeline down through the middle of all that, it's going to stir up all that toxic waste, and many towns along the Hudson get all their drinking water from the river. So there's huge environmental problems. So we need to think carefully about what green transition would look like, and we need to really mobilize around a just and democratically controlled build out of clean power. And that's the yes that I was talking about at the outset. What is if we're engaged in really powerful blockadia struggles against new frack gas and pipelines coming into the city, what is the yes really going to look like? I'm part of the public power campaign in New York City, which I think is a really important campaign. The goal is to expand the New Deal era New York Power Authority, which gets a lot of its renewable energy from hydro upstate, around the Great Lakes. And so the idea is to mandate a massively expanded public authority, which is going to get exclusively green power. And we'll have a new governance structure, which is going to be genuinely democratic, so that it involves not just some political appointees from the governor, but would also include representation from environmental justice groups, from affected communities, from labor unions, et cetera, et cetera. So this public power campaign is creating huge amounts of waves. We got a lot of legislative backing during the last session, but we didn't get it passed. So the push is on to really try and get this passed. And I'm here to encourage all of you to start a similar kind of campaign here in Philadelphia, if there isn't already one. I think it's really important to have a positive yes and to be able to conceptualize energy as the people's and as a democratic and just phenomenon. I can go into why that should be and what it might look like in more detail if folks have questions. But for now, I would say that starting a campaign like this is hugely important. We want to proliferate these campaigns because they can really put pressure on the existing establishment and kind of create a pathway towards a wholly different dispensation in the energy realm and in social transition towards a better society. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Okay, so next up we have Gavan. Kanara is the poetic, can you take this off? Sorry. Kanara is the poetic practice fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, where they are completing a dissertation about representations of environmental crisis in contemporary U.S. poetry. Kanara is a poet, teacher, and environmental justice organizer, and their chapbook, Bella, did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Is available through Operating System. Recent poems can be found in West Branch and Perpetual Doom, and their essay on climate grief is in the inaugural issue of Amulet, a journal of poetics. Please join me in welcoming Kanara.
Leave it to the poets to kind of create semi-words that are not easily recognizable. Sorry about that. Yeah, all the journal titles too. So hi everyone, I'm Pinar. Thank you so much for making worlds and for being here. I'm really happy to talk to you all. So I'm actually gonna switch the order in which I'm talking about things just to kind of have a bit of a continuation from your discussion. Thank you so much. Yeah. So first I want to talk a little bit about my work in Philly, USA, and specifically on the Green New Deal Commission. I have been on that commission for a little over a year, and we are currently developing it's called We Own PGW campaign around public power, and this is kind of month 2 or 3, so it's a very early moment for this campaign. But we very much are interested in this idea of energy commons and specifically getting PGW to shift off of natural gas. And so we're in the kind of developmental stages and having kind of strategy talks and things in the coming months. There's something at the end of November, as well as a strategy meeting early in December. And I'm excited to learn a little more too about what's going on in New York City, because I think that's going to be a really useful example for us in building this campaign, which we want to be very coalitional. We want to really center the kinds of environmental justice issues that are entwined with energy justice issues, and kind of think and work carefully with communities and to sort of also bring people into, having some ownership over challenging the way that they receive their energy and making demands on PGW to operate as a public resource, which PGW is a publicly owned utility as well. And so I guess I mostly just want to welcome people into that work if they are at all interested, and perhaps I could talk a little bit more about it later. And I'll just flag, Green New Deal Commission is also doing work around green schools as well as around transit in Philadelphia. So it's kind of an exciting and growing community of people who are really interested in environmental and climate justice here in Philly. And now I'm going to go to what was going to be first, which is about a slightly different kind of area of a kind of environmental justice, and not as squarely in the energy domain, is what I'm trying to say. So I have been working for the past year or so with a group called Chester Residents Concerned for Quality Living, or Circle, they go by Circle, CRQL, Chester Residents Concerned for Quality Living. Zuleen Mayfield is the founder of that group, and it's kind of a community-led grassroots group that's been working for about 30 years in Chester to oppose a whole host of toxic industries. But most recently, that struggle is centered around Covanta, which is a waste-to-energy facility. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about burning trash and the many risks in that, and in fact, you have energy in that term, right? Waste to energy. So it is kind of ensnared in questions around regimes of energy and how we're going to create renewables. Sometimes it gets called a renewable form of waste disposal, which it very much is not for a number of reasons. Maybe I won't go too deeply into, but I'm happy to talk more if anyone's interested. And so, yeah, I guess I'm just going to talk briefly about incinerators, because I feel like, what we do with our trash is so, like, our energy consumption, so embedded in our kind of daily lives. It can be quite invisible and sort of something we can go any number of days or weeks, right, without really contemplating. And yet we have a huge kind of waste disposal problem. So, yeah, let's see, what do I want to do? So one thing to think about with incineration is that, so say you have 100 tons of a given form of waste, right? When you incinerate that waste, you're going to get about 70 tons of air pollution and 30 tons of toxic ash. So you're actually not eliminating the waste, you're kind of translating it into two different very, very toxic forms, both of which are, leaching various carcinogens and other contaminants into the air, into, these landfills, when that kind of toxic ash is deposited in landfills. And so there's sort of a multi-billion problem with incineration. And, the kind of fence line community in Chester kind of experiences the most immediate impact of incineration. But it is the Coventa incinerator is a top pollutant throughout kind of the Philly region and even the broader kind of 5-county region and beyond. This stuff enters the air and stays there. So I want to highlight just kind of a couple of the elements of this as an environmental justice issue. So for one thing, only 1.8% of the trash burned at this facility is created in Chester. So they're receiving none of the benefits of having this industry there. They're breathing it in every day. There are all kinds of really horrible health impacts that come with incineration. And so that's kind of a very, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I was talking about the health impacts. And yeah, so only like less than 2% of the trash is actually from Chester. The vast majority of it comes from Philly, it comes from New York City, it comes from New Jersey, and is imported to be burned. And so, trucked in, then the ash is trucked out and landfilled. When you landfill ash, it's sort of like the metaphor Mike Ewald, who's of Energy Justice Network, which is a really cool group. He uses this metaphor of coffee grounds, but basically think about trying to brew coffee with beans rather than ground coffee. The beans, you're not going to get much coffee out of that. But if you take a bunch of toxic stuff, it's all incinerated and turned into this ash, you then have it on this landfill as cover. You're basically making a big nasty coffee that is quite poisonous itself, right? Gets into soil and groundwater and all these things. And so the entire process from beginning to end is quite dirty, and we again have this issue of like importing damage to a community that then is in no way compensated, and despite struggles for now since 1992, this kind of industry persists. So maybe a particularly relevant thing is contract renewals are approaching for this Coventa facility, and again, like largest in the country, fewest pollution controls as well, which is very much the product of environmental racism, which is very entrenched in this particular city. And on the sort of yes side, though, there are really active, vibrant struggles as well. And so there's so much work being done on the ground there. Yeah. Maybe I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to kind of go into more details about this and about kind of Circle's work throughout Delco, as well as kind of their upcoming work potentially in Philly as the Philly contract renewal with Coventa approaches. So yeah.
Okay, so next up we have Emma. Emma Glasser is an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania studying materials science and engineering and environmental science. She has worked at PRISE, Resources for the Future, Delaware Valley Regional Climate Commission, and the Sociospatial Climate Collaborative. This work has included research on energy affordability, decarbonization technologies and policies, the economic impacts of wildfires on water quality, and the Green New Deal. Her passions revolve around climate justice and community organizing. They organize with the student-led climate justice group Fossil Free Pen, the abolitionist collective Police Free Pen, and spent the summer of 2021 with the Indigenous-led resistance to stop Line 3, a tar sands pipeline. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be on this panel and be with you all today. I'm going to talk a little bit about mostly I'm just going to talk about my experience at Line 3, talk about the other stuff too, but so first I wanted to just say a little bit about what Line 3 is. It's a tar sands pipeline. It goes from Alberta, Canada to Superior, Wisconsin, and it is carrying tar sands, which are one of the dirtiest of all fossil fuels, and it's also not economically viable at all, but nonetheless, this pipeline is being built, or has been built by Enbridge, which is a Canadian multinational energy company, and they are the same company that's responsible for the largest inland oil spill in the United States, in Kalamazoo. The pipeline crosses 227 bodies of water, including the Mississippi River, which it crosses twice. It also crosses the shores of Lake Superior. It goes through 800 wetlands and crosses 22 rivers. So that's some of that. The pipeline has the CO2 emissions equivalent of 15 new coal-fired plants. It is ready to have 1 million tons, a million something of tar sands per day, 1 million barrels, of tar sands per day. And also, very importantly, it crosses the treaty territory of the Anishinaabe peoples. It violates Indigenous people's rights to free, prior, and informed consent. It also violates the Ojibwe people's rights to hunt, fish, gather medicinal plants, and harvest wild rice. One thing that's really important to note is it's not really a matter of if, but when pipelines spill, and wild rice is the wild rice that grows. Sorry, I forgot to mention that this pipe is the pipeline goes through northern Minnesota, which is where so-called northern Minnesota, which is where there are many indigenous tribes and nations where the pipeline goes through. It's one of the only places in the world where wild rice grows, and wild rice requires extremely clean water. And once the pipeline spills into these pristine wetlands, the wild rice will never grow again. So this is actually cultural genocide, so in addition to all of these things, it's also important to note that in building this pipeline, a bunch of out-of-state workers come in. Most of them are men, and this leads to high rates of sex trafficking. There's already extremely high rates of murdered and missing Indigenous women, children, two-spirit relatives, and these pipeline workers are directly responsible for sex trafficking in the region. There were 6, during the summer, there were 6 men who were arrested for, including 2 Line 3 workers, who were arrested for a sex trafficking sting happening in the region. And then Sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you. And honestly, I can feel it in my body. Like, it's really heavy stuff. Enbridge also, in order to build the pipeline, they took 5 billion gallons of water from the rivers around and water bodies around Minnesota. During the summer, you could just see the river levels falling. Also throughout the summer, through the processes of drilling, there were 28 drilling mud spills, which are called frac outs, where the drilling fluid exits their hole that they are using to drill for the pipeline, and it enters the water bodies, and it contains additives which are really bad for the environment. And actually, I really recommend going online, thinking where you can look. I know on Business Line 3's Instagram, you can see this really shocking photo of a before and after at the headwaters of the Mississippi River, which have experienced many frac outs, and you can just see, it's really horrifying to see the difference between before and after the frac outs there. So there's been indigenous-led resistance to this pipeline for over 8 years, and the pipeline construction started in December 2020. Once it started, there was a sustained direct action movement. There were many tactics that were used, but once the pipeline started, direct action was used to try and stop construction. Since construction started, there have been over 900 arrests, now is kind of where I want to talk a little bit about just, I don't know, what this experience really changed for me. Going into it, over COVID, I had become more radicalized, anti-capitalist, abolitionist, like all of these things. Started doing work with Police Free Pen. I had been organizing with Fossil Free Pen since I started going to school, and we did these really cool presentations on climate in the carceral state, where we explained the intersection between climate justice and abolition and how they were actually intimately linked in the same thing. So going into the summer, I theoretically understood and had talked about how these two things were really linked, but being on the front lines materialized everything that I had thought, everything that I theoretically knew to be true. On the front lines, there was no difference between Fuck the Police and climate justice or Stop Line 3. They were exactly the same thing, because as soon as you tried to stop the pipeline, you were brutally attacked by the police. And so there was no difference. They were the same. And what's really crazy is that Enbridge, the pipeline company, the energy company, they were required to pay the police for every single hour or minute that they spent protecting the pipeline. And that amounted to $2.9 million that Enbridge gave the Minnesota police. They actually formed a task force called the Northern Lights Task Force, where they worked together and coordinated their response to the pipeline protesters. So every single second that they spent repressing the protesters, they were paid by Enbridge. I told my friend about this, and she said, wow, so they were just paid mercenaries? Yes. It was a truly different experience to be there and to see that, and to see my friends experiencing intense state and police repression when trying to protect everything that is sacred, when fighting for indigenous sovereignty and climate justice, to fight to protect the water. So it was clear that abolition and climate justice are the same thing, and that we actually can't achieve climate justice without abolition, because once you try and stop the fossil fuel power, the first people who are there to stop you are the police. And don't forget about the prisons too. And so, but this runs even deeper because actually the reason why they're able to do this in many cases was also just because of the fossil fuel industry lobbying government. The fossil fuel industry in every single state where a pipeline is being built, this is the new thing, the fossil fuel industry has put it into law, like lobbied and legislated so that it is illegal to trespass on pipeline lands or any, actually not even just where they're building pipelines, but also energy facilities. So if you're trying to stop a coal plant, it's quite possible that it is illegal by law to trespass on there. It's called, in a lot of states, it's a gross misdemeanor. In Minnesota, it was a gross misdemeanor, and it's called gross misdemeanor trespassing on critical infrastructure pipeline. That's the charge that so many people got this summer. It was like the most common thing to hand someone. If you're literally just standing on Enbridge's property, they can hand you this. It's a gross misdemeanor, which means that it is worse than a misdemeanor. Yeah, and so that was like the common charge to give people, I think, the maximum, I think it's like $1,000 fine up to 30 days in jail. Yeah, and then throughout the summer, as things started escalating, they started handing out felony charges, which was a very common thing as the summer went on. Basically, people would try and stop the construction by locking themselves to equipment. And there was one day when people locked themselves to drill bits, and the police decided to hand them felony charges. These were felony theft charges, and they gave it to them under this law that says that they were claiming that they were stealing Enbridge's time, is how they were saying this. So basically by locking down to their equipment, they were stealing Enbridge's time without their consent, and it's possible that if this falls through in court, they could be liable to pay, to pay Enbridge for the time that they lost, the money equivalent of what they lost of those work hours. That happened too. So there are 900 people who have been arrested. They're facing these criminal charges. So I just want to finish. Sorry, I'm running out of time. So the police and state repression that happened there was intense, but I think, as Ashley mentioned, it's like one thing that I really took away from the experience was that whenever we are fighting evil, fossil fuel power, we also need to be building community, and that was something that was very much present on the front lines. There were many different indigenous-led resistance camps where people were camping and communally eating, communally protecting each other. There were medic tents where we would look after each other. Yes, we were cooking together. We would have meetings about community safety, and so I think, and we had solar panels because we were living without electricity, or we had a little bit, and so it was a really transformative experience that definitely changed the way I see the world, and thank you for listening.
Thanks for that, Emma. All right, so last but not least, we have Billy Fleming. Billy is the founding Wilkes Family Director of the this is a very long title, sorry. The Ian L. McHarg Center in the Weitzman School of Design, a senior fellow with Data for Progress and co-director of the Climate Plus Community Project. He is co-editor of Design with Nature Now and a blueprint for coastal adaptation. He's the lead author of An Atlas for the Green New Deal, and his writing has been published in Places Journal, Dissent Magazine, Jacobin, The Atlantic, and The Guardian, among others. Please welcome Billy.
for having me. It's such a pleasure to be up here with y'all. To see folks whose like work I had known and admired for a while, like Gavan and Ashley, and Emma, who I think the last time I saw Emma in person and not on the Zoom screen was at a Green New Deal event I held with some friends a couple of years ago on Penn's campus, where at the end of the event, towards the end of the event, as like Naomi Klein, Julia Noyes-Cat, Jay McAlevey are like finishing up their remarks. Emma very smartly came up to Daniel and I and said, hey, I have a thing I want you to read about fossil free Penn at the end of it. And I don't know if it's because we were just tired and knew that Emma would crush it. We just like said, why don't you just go say it? We're tired of talking. And it was, you know, maybe not the highlight, but one of like 2 or 3 highlights of the entire day. So it's great to see you again in person and to see all of you here. So I'm gonna start with some like terrible news, which I feel like we've been talking about a little bit, and then try to end with like a little bit of better news, a little bit of optimism. And I have notes in like multiple places, so I'm like scanning around. Sorry about that. But one of those is just to like to zoom out for a moment and think about what the last 11 months, the first 11 months of what's shaping to be a very disastrous Biden administration have left us with when we think about questions of climate justice, energy democracy, and the Green New Deal. And, you know, not knowing what will happen with what is the, I think, referred to by his team as their climate bill, the Build Back Better plan, which we can talk about whether there's actually any climate provisions in there in a moment. There are a couple things just to like, I think, sit with here. So one of the sort of first initiatives announced by the Biden administration around some of these questions is something called J40, Justice 40 Initiative. The way it's often talked about is it's this idea that 40% of all federal investment would be set aside for frontline and fence-line communities. What you probably know, but if you don't, we lost that fight actually within like the first days of the Biden administration. So the way J40 is written, it's no longer all federal investment, it's just the BIF and BBB plans, and it's no longer direct investment, it's just the benefits of investment, right? So folks who know the California cap and trade experience pretty well know they have a similar provision, right? Where a set aside has to have direct benefits to EJ and CJ communities, which means that accountants get to do a bunch of really creative work. All of those who get trained at work and get to go, you know, figure out how to count dollars for PG&E as dollars for frontline and fence-line communities. We're poised to see the exact same thing with J40. You think about the Civilian Climate Corps, Climate Civilian Corps, Climate Conservation Corps, whatever like permutation of it has been thrown around out there. The most ambitious forms of this, right, were around direct federal employment and around doing all kinds of things, unbuilding fossil fuel infrastructure, stewarding and remediating brownfield and Superfund sites, doing the hard and often underfunded or unfunded care work that stitches all of our everyday lives together. And if a version of that is signed into law, it's pretty clear at this point it's going to be the worst possible version, right? The kind that's housed in Americorps, that pays almost nothing, and that leaves most communities who become Americorps sort of sites or Americorps community sites with no real longevity or continuity, no real program for investment. One of the weaker sort of provisions to sort of advance so far. Another, not to like I could just talk forever about all the terrible things, but I'm going to try not to do that. But one that's been stripped out that I think has been touted as a big loss for the climate community, and I'm not so sure it is the CEPP, Clean Energy Power Plant. So this is, for folks who don't know, this is the idealized form of a market-based climate solution. It's modeled after Texas's and others' renewable portfolio standards law. You don't know, right? Texas's RPS, their renewable portfolio standards law, basically sets certain thresholds of renewable energy provision that must be provided by public investment in the state. Their version of it is also the reason why, in large part, Texas's grid collapsed, or nearly collapsed catastrophically. It did for many people, but it did not suffer the kind of, say, Puerto Rico scale was going to be a complete structural collapse, although it was very close. Most people have attributed that sort of fragile systems, I don't know, fragility in that sort of cold spell in January to the RPS, which for lots of reasons has completely deregulated their grid, has provided some wind and other forms of renewable energy, but it's otherwise created what's known as a robust and fragile system. So the moment it gets shocked, the whole thing collapses. This is what CEPP was poised to do for us, and I'm actually not so sure it's a bad thing that it's going to close that in the middle. Although some of my some of my notionally left, but to my right colleagues in the energy world would disagree with me. And then the other I would say is that, one of the other things that's been sort of bandied about is like a clear win in either the infrastructure or Build Back Better plan conversations has been a set aside of money for what they're calling climate resilience investments. And when you look at the language of the bill that's passed and now the version that's being still debated, the framework plan anyway, almost all of that climate infrastructure resilience investment is set aside for what are called critical facilities. Some of those are very good. They're like hospitals and schools. That's not where the money's going to go. It's going to go towards prisons. It's going to go towards oil and gas facilities. And we're going to spend $150 billion armoring them, preparing them for sea level rise and storm surge, and do what we normally do, which is leave everyone else to fend for themselves. I say all that in part because this is a way, I think, of recognizing that this might be the first Democratic administration of my lifetime to actually live up to their campaign promise, which is to return us to normal. This is what they are doing. Folks in here, I'm sure, have had similar bouts of apoplexy watching former President Obama go to COP this week and talk about climate leadership months after he, was on TV talking about, his role in making the U.S. a domestic energy, oil and gas exporter. And I think in some ways what we're seeing is a return to that administration's view of energy and climate and economy, not just in the protection and instantiation of oil and gas production, but also in these jingoistic, Buy American energy production, infrastructure production policies. And I think embedded in all of that weakness is are a couple of bright spots. Some of which actually, some of the work that colleagues and I have done around Green New Deals for public schools and for public housing, buoyed in large part by a joint campaign with DSA, of which Philly DSA has been one of the chapters that absolutely drove down with us on, aligned with Congressman Bowman and Congressman Ocasio-Cortez, New York. Most of the money that was recommended for those things is still in there. And I know it's driving folks in the administration crazy because one of the former Obama housing people who I used to butt heads with when I worked in DC, I was in Politico this week complaining that we were putting money into public housing and not affordable housing production. So I'm pretty excited that he's mad about that. The other thing I would say, that's the high level view, I think, of where things stand with domestic climate policy in this administration, which is mostly bad news, a couple of tiny scraps we managed to win. I think in the near term, so in the work that I get to do here and through Climate Community Project, which is this really fantastic collection of activist scholars, mostly junior, folks like Daniel Cohen, formerly here in Philly, exiled to Berkeley, just a huge loss for us and absurdly dumb move for Penn to let him go. I think about folks like Theoria Francos at Providence, Olivia Taiwo at Georgetown, Shalonda Baker, formerly at Northeastern, in a weird little detour in which she's probably not going to get confirmed, but it's in the Biden administration for at least the next few months. The theory of change there has been pretty clear for us. It's been one that the built environment is a critical site of contestation and investment when we think about the investment side of climate policy. And I don't mean investment in the sense that real estate developers think of it. I think of it in the sense of thinking through how a fence line front line community is produced through manufacturing care, which is mostly just a decade-long disinvestment campaign in specific neighborhoods, certainly, and also in particular regions like the Mississippi Delta, like Appalachia, like other parts of the country. And that for us, that means not just the built environment is important when we, in general, are thinking about climate investment, but on the topic of energy democracy, to recognize that as important as carbon molecules and electrons are, no one will ever be brought into this movement through a change in the source of the electrons in their circuits. We're not going to power on the lights in here and feel in a material way that this building is now powered by wind and solar instead of oil and gas, although it would be great for us. And we're not going to walk outside and notice a change in the density of carbon molecules as we warmer in our neighborhoods. But the things we do notice are direct investments in where we live, in ourselves, in our communities, in our homes, where we work, kids, where you send them to school. You take transportation, whether it's personal or public, to and from, what that experience is like. These are the ways, one of the ways in which we can think about both directing the kind of investment that a Green New Deal would make possible to the places that need it the most, and growing the kind of coalition behind a package like the D&D large enough and long enough to give us a chance to do this at scale and not just be stuck with a couple of pilot projects in a few places that are probably getting them because they're looking connected. And with that, I should say a couple things about a bit of work that I'm working on now with a bunch of colleagues kind of all around the country, but focused in Appalachia and Mississippi Delta. Both of them dealing with a particular kind of post-fossil fuel and prison sort of nexus. So to Emma's comments here about decarceration or racial justice and climate justice with the Green New Deal, this is kind of the core of that work. One of the work in Appalachia centers around sort of three big prison sites. USP Big Sandy, built atop an abandoned mine land, USP Mercury, built atop an abandoned mine land, and then a planned and successfully killed prison site, USP Letcher, also planned atop an abandoned mine land site. So if you don't know, the AML program, Abandoned Mine Lands Program, includes about 2.5 million or so acres of formerly productive coal fields around the U.S. They're clustered pretty tightly in two locations. One's the American Southwest, and the other is Appalachia. And in Appalachia, there are sort of three common afterlives for those facilities. One of those is to remain abandoned in perpetuity. The second is to get some really shitty, like savanna or prairie grass planting that provides no ecological benefit, probably doesn't even remediate the site, but it's cheap, so former coal operators will go to state to them. And the other is prison development. And for reasons that are probably obvious to you, right? The commercial system operates as like an economic development fix. And these are places of historic disinvestment where if there is any economic activity, it's often through either the commercial or fossil fuel system. And so, through some studio work that happens on campus and then through CCP, the kind of community project, which unintentionally but hilariously has the same acronym as the Chinese Communist Party, are working with a range of groups, including Black in Appalachia, Reimagine Appalachia, a bunch of the activist groups who led the fight to stop USP Letcher, which was a $500 million proposed prison facility that even Bureau of Prisons said they didn't want. Working with them to think about, one, what the afterlife of that site might look like now if it were handed over through democratic means to people who practically live with its legacy. And then to think through not just the decarceration of Mercury and Big Sandy, but to think through what the material alternatives are to that. One of the reasons I'm so glad we're in this space and making worlds, because what that work is about is a set of speculative fictions and world building led by the movements who have been behind the closure of those prison facilities, the identification of them as critical sites of contestation, and the keeping in the ground of fossil fuels in those regions for a very long time. And then the other work in the Mississippi Delta, which is related, but with a different set of sort of interlocutors, mostly the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, Sean Battle, who's their executive director, and a bunch of their folks who work with them, thinking through a similar, so if you think about the coal field to prison pipeline in Appalachia, the Delta's version of that is the plantation to prison pipeline. And Parchman and Angola Farm, otherwise known as the Louisiana and Mississippi State Penitentiaries, are sort of the focus for us in that work. And again, thinking through the role of sort of movement-led speculative fiction in prefiguring the kind of role that we need, that we want, that we deserve, rather than thinking about what we do with the role we have that makes it 7% better, right? And also looking at one other correctional facility, which is not a state-run facility, but called the Forge Correctional Facility. This is the place where almost all of the sandbags for the city of New Orleans were made by incarcerated people whose prison then was underwater for most of that. So they were left in the facility, video being submerged, while the sandbags that they made for 20 cents a day were sent to New Orleans to sort of protect a few strategic neighborhoods, which, unsurprisingly means white and mostly wealthy neighborhoods. And so, not to end on too big a note, because that's pretty bleak. But I will say again that I think one of the big challenges for us is that we live in a right-wing utopia, right? So the right has always been very good at imagining the world they want and building it. And again, one of the reasons I'm so glad we're in this space, having this conversation, and that I feel like we're at a different moment for the left than the one that I was sort of cutting my teeth in maybe 10 years ago, is that conversation around world and world building is ascendant. And I think the importance of imagining and spatializing and winning the kind of future that we want to serve is as active as it's probably ever been, at least in this country. And so with that, I will stop talking and remask and look forward to our conversation.
So we wanted to give you all an opportunity to talk to each other, if you have questions for one another, if there's things you wanted to elaborate on or comment on each other's presentations. We have some time for you to do that now, and then we'll open it up to everyone else for questions and discussion. So I'll let you sort of decide who wants to ask or comment first of the four of you.
Well, I have a question for my fellow panelists, or maybe two questions. If this is a moment of sort of world building, or if we can think of this as here where the last few years have been characterized by what one English critic sort of calls generation left, right? You know, this sense of political possibility that comes with movements mobilizing, putting pressure on the state, and hoping that the state will be responsive, you know, in the form of a Green New Deal, or in the form of stopping Line 3, for instance. What do we do when that doesn't happen? You know, what should the responsive movements be when our efforts to change the state largely fail, or, you know, don't pass enough to keep the momentum going, which seems to, in some ways, be the moment we're kind of talking about right now. So I wonder what people think about that, or am I mischaracterizing the moment? It might be another way of asking the question.
I just have a quick thought, which is that I do think the kind of vitriol is just building, and that kind of lack of surprise when the state really is just continuously failing, maybe is energizing these struggles in really important ways and really pushing people to rethink really the quite steep demands that we need to be making, and the kind of requirements that are associated with those in terms of building connections across difference, and like really kind of thinking about different struggles together and at intersections, and trying to bring as many people as we can into these things, because we really need a much more mass version of this kind of environmental justice, climate justice. And so that's a hopeful thought. I don't know. I know I feel it building, and I'm like super mad about all this going on. And I think that can be quite productive.
Yeah, I think like I do agree with your characterization, and it was something that I definitely was thinking about and feeling this summer, and talking to people about. I think like my answer would be like, as much as we can, we can't. My answer would be that we can't wait for the state to enact climate justice. As much as we can, we need to start doing that ourselves. And the same thing with, you know, reparations. Like, if we just keep on waiting for the state to start giving reparations, like they're not going to do that. So I really do believe in creating those solutions in our communities, whether it's through mutual aid, whether it's through community-owned solar. Obviously, some communities are more equipped to do that than others, but redistributing wealth and creating collective ways of, I think my answer would be to start enacting the solutions on the smaller scale. In your community, start doing everything that we talk about when we talk about climate justice and the Green New Deal. Think about how you can make that happen tomorrow or in a month or in 2 months, and you know, sometimes sometimes you can't just yell at the government because they're not gonna do it. And I think like to add another question to that is like how to really make that happen for everyone. I don't know, but to start in your community and think about how to do it in a just way.
Yeah. I mean, this is such a great question. I'm also curious to hear you respond to this actually, to your own question. I'd love to ask myself questions I can answer. But I think there's a couple things here. So one is, I think it's just going to foreground for a lot of people who maybe were aware of this but hadn't like fully got into it. Just like the limits of this elite persuasion model, right? The popularism crowd who are of the opinion that like the way that we achieve things like an energy transition or a just transition or a Green New Deal is through like issue-based bullying, and then like convincing people to do the right thing because we like have the right answers. And this idea that the world operates like a standardized test where we show up with a Scantron and it's like filled out correctly and we get the things we want. And not that there haven't been people like fighting in other ways, but I think it's just raising for lots of people, particularly like younger generations, the complete like inability of those modes of change to achieve any of the things that we've been talking about here tonight. And so I think like to Mark's point, like this is, I would like feel the like weight and weakness of this moment and also see it like radicalizing a bunch of people who were not radicalized by COVID, not radicalized by the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and other events last summer or last year. And so yeah, see this as a moment of people, I think, sort of coming to terms with the limits of that way of engaging in politics. The other is that I also think like we're going to wind up with a bunch of new sites of contestation, and I'm interested to see how we handle them, because if you look at where the like industrial scale investments from the Biden are coming, they're not on renewable energy deployment, they're on carbon capture and sequestration and direct air capture technology. And I think I've been convinced that there's probably some tiny percentage of like overall climate spending that might have to go into this at some point, but it's very telling that that's where almost all of the investment is going, and it's going there first. And I'm curious to see how the left responds to that, because they aren't jobs programs for the most part. They're giveaways to oil and gas companies, either to like fudge the math to get to net zero or to do against oil recovery. And they basically haven't been used at an industrial scale to do anything else ever in the world. So I'm curious to see like what we do with those. How do we strategize and develop new tactics around the halting of those, the way that we've, I think, become pretty good at around pipelines and prisons and other things we've talked about tonight. And I think it's, you know, in the ether of maybe this conversation, certainly in the climate left, is Andres Malm's book, right? The global pipeline, and this idea of sabotage and eco-terrorism as like an increasingly attractive option for people who I think rightfully feel like there may be no other way of achieving the kinds of things we talk about here. And I still don't know like what to do with that thesis, and I would be curious to hear all of y'all respond to that book. But yeah, I mean, again, I'm like on the verge of being persuaded that like this is a thing it's going to happen. So how do we go about doing it in a way that is like as safe as possible for people? And I guess like, well, it's great by now. It's like extremely dark. Yeah, I guess I should just like stop there, because there's lots of other things I could say, but my notes are in like terrible handwriting. And yeah, I'm curious to hear your response to your own question, and then the other things you talked about.
Okay. So sort of quickly, you know, I think it's pretty obvious that, as W.B. Du Bois said, you know, race is the problem in America, not just of the 20th century, but the 21st century. We're in a moment of kind of white supremacist reassertion. A lot of the recent victories for the right have come in opposition to the abolition movement. And so I think it's absolutely essential to tackle white supremacy and the legacy of racial capitalism and settler colonialism. And you know, not just in terms of sort of rhetoric and in terms of analyzing these histories, but in terms of the specificities of how this all plays out and the ways that, as some critics have said, you know, we don't get to have nice things here in this country because of how fucked up we are and how white supremacist this country is. So why don't we have universal health care? Why don't we have free childcare? You know, why don't we have 60% renewable energy like the Germans do, or 100% renewable energy like they do in Costa Rica or Uruguay, right? It's just because of the fact that, you know, capitalist interests have been able to play people off against one another, and particularly to play the white working class off against racialized populations in this country. And that kind of sucker move has to be dismantled. And so I think there has to be a lot of really concrete, hard educational work around that, and a lot of really militant mobilizing. And just to give you like one sense of one sector that could really use a lot of help in this regard, the unions. You know, I was talking about energy, right? One of the huge problems in our power campaign in New York State is that we can't get the unions on board, or at least we can't get the unions that are connected to energy. Those are largely male and white unions, and they identify with the big investor-owned utilities like Con Ed and National Grid. They don't identify with communities of color that are getting shafted by those groups. And they themselves are getting shafted, right? I mean, Con Ed has a massive union smashing fund and regularly tries to break its own union. And yet, the union won't side with our public power legislation. So, we really need to build a potent force within the labor sector that challenges these ideologies, and ultimately, it doesn't just like aggregate enough folks who are progressive in the union sector, but actually helps to dismantle these sort of ideologies and the identifications that are connected to them. So I think, the kind of politics of sort of seeing the state in a negative way, which is behind a lot of what's happening now, is directly connected to racism and white supremacy, and that really has to be tackled and smashed, I would say. So that's my answer for you. There's a lot more, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts about the question of sabotage, if we have time. Do we have time for one more round?
Yeah, if we do one more quick round, and then we're
Round of panelists. Emma, I'd love to hear what conversations are happening in line 3, because I know people are thinking about that directly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much I should say.
Speak out of that.
But,
online.
I think, I mean, I don't know, sabotage. I mean, we've already seen these types of tactics used in pipeline fights. Jessica Resnick is somebody who was recently imprisoned for doing a bunch of different things around the one, Standing Rock, that one, thank you, Jessica Resnick, look her up, support her. She caused millions of dollars of damage in doing a bunch of basically sabotage-esque things to the pipeline, but the thing is like, did it work? Like, I don't know, like, the thing is, I don't have the answers. I don't claim to have the answers. That's why we all need to talk amongst ourselves and think about it. But I mean, we do need to stop fossil fuels, and we do need to stop fossil fuel infrastructure. Sabotage is a way that many people think that may be necessary in the future, especially in the midst of climate catastrophe. But I think, like, in terms of like the real thing that matters is like suffering in my head, like people suffering, and things that I've been reminded of through this conversation is that like in the moment we stand, we have so much fossil fuel infrastructure, and we don't have much of a plan for climate adaptation. Like, climate change is here, it's happening. It's ravaging our world, and something like the thing that came out of the summer in my head was like, my friend told me her dream was to build like basically a housing co-op climate refugee center in her community, and I thought that was a beautiful dream, because I think like if we don't have the legislative means at the moment to protect our communities from climate disasters, they're coming tomorrow. And I think we need to start thinking about like how we're gonna protect each other in the wake of the next, hurricane, in the wake of the next power grid failure, because, as Daniel Cohen talks about, climate apartheid is real. Like, the rich white communities are going to be okay. Like they're going to pay for firefighters to hose down their houses like Kim K did. They're gonna have solar panels on their homes, so when there's grid failure, they have energy. And so we need to start thinking about how we're gonna protect each other and the most vulnerable people. And sabotage like may be necessary to prevent climate destruction and disaster, but that's already happening. And so we also need to think about how we're gonna protect each other from the inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, I love that last part of your comment, and I think protection and sort of refuge building is certainly really, really important. Yeah, I go back and forth on the question of sabotage, and I mean, particularly when, some of our most effective saboteurs are now, incarcerated workers because of their actions to oppose fossil fuel projects, and so, and many of those are indigenous peoples or, people of color kind of opposing these projects. And so we want to recommend sabotage in that case. And I mean, I don't know that I can come out with a strong yes. Maybe there are other forms of sabotage that we haven't quite imagined yet that would be more effective than sort of tangling with so-called critical infrastructure. I don't know what this would be though. Maybe computer people can help us out. I don't know. I'm surprised sort of some master hackery forms of sabotage haven't happened with some of these kind of ecological strategists out there, but so I'm not quite sure about sabotage, but I do just think, and it's certainly not a solution in a broad sense, but I do think local solutions are so crucial, and I think, just to return to the work that Circle, for example, does, they're kind of trying to build support for zero waste resolutions all across the county, and kind of in turn get Delaware counties or council behind shifting to zero waste and stopping incineration. And those efforts have been quite effective, and it's really building, and you really see how powerful that movement is. And so, on these kind of scales of more local government stuff, you can get people, you can kind of push on some of these projects. The larger sort of multinational things are more challenging. I don't have an answer for that right now.
Let me just very quickly weigh in here. I think it's important to acknowledge that sabotage has been happening in various different places in the United States, and that the right has reacted through this raft of criminalization flows all around the country. And so it's making it increasingly difficult to engage in nonviolent acts of disobedience. Now, is that a good thing? You could argue that, this is showing people the hand of the state and how repressive it is, and that this is going to ramp up resistance. That could be true. But it seems to me that the US context is very different from the one out of which Andreas Malm writes. He's writing in a social democracy where there's a lot more support, even electoral support for green parties and left-wing alternatives. As we've been talking about, we live in a secular colonial state characterized by white supremacy. And what did you say, Billy? I really liked your line, that kind of right-wing utopia, right? I mean, that's what we live in. So I think forces on the ground need to assess strategies from that perspective. Let's do another sort of hypothetical thought experiment. What if we could put all of the CEOs of fossil fuel companies in prison tomorrow, right? They're all climate criminals. Prosecute them and put them in prison. Well, there'd probably just be more of those criminals, right? So the same might be true for pipelines. You blow up one pipeline, there are going to be more pipelines, right? So whatever acts we engage in have to be part of a broader process of constructing social movements and changing popular opinion in order to take over the state to push transformation, and you know, on whatever different scale, local all the way up to national and global, to build the kinds of movements we need to really make the changes we want to see. So I know that sounds very big and idealistic, but you know, I think when Malm writes about blowing up a pipeline, he does very carefully say that the groups doing that should release statements saying, we're doing this because you're doing X, Y, and Z thing. So he's kind of clearly thinking of that ideological struggle. It's not just that by blowing up the pipeline, you're going to stop fossil capitalism. You know, that physical sabotage is not the only thing he's thinking of. So I think I'm just restating his case. But clearly, the stakes are so much higher in many ways here in the United States, particularly for frontline communities. It's such a hard topic to talk about. Should we turn things over to questions from the audience? Yeah, okay. Great.
So questions? Go ahead, please.
Well, I actually have a very pedestrian question that I wanted to ask you about Circle.
Yeah, sure.
And where is the ash being landfilled?
So I believe it's in Berks County landfill. I actually don't know off the top of my head. But of course, yeah, I mean, there are always questions too about, where the landfill is sited.
And the other question is, given that air is no respecter of boundaries, has there been any effort to engage in Westchester in this regard? Because they are in the area of Chester's
Right, yeah.
incinerators, and I wonder, because I was involved in a lot of work bringing together students from Chester and from Westchester, and sort of trying to paint a picture of the results of the system that we have, and it was very interesting. I mean, it's a mixed bag by all means, but it would be very interesting to me to talk to people in Westchester, which is a very wealthy community, how they feel about the pollution from the incineration plant blowing over their homes.
So I'm from Philly. Can you tell me, is Westchester in Delaware County?
No, actually, Westchester is in Chester County.
Okay, that's what I
It's very
guessed.
confusing.
Yeah.
But it is adjacent.
Yeah,
It's just a bridge.
I don't actually know of any connections, but I can certainly check on that for you.
I think it would be a very fascinating way to spend a Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and it's important to raise awareness.
So, but do you know where in Berks the landfill goes?
I'm sorry.
Do you know where in Berks County the landfill goes?
I don't off the top of my head. Sorry.
I'll see if I can.
Yeah, if you go to Chester Residents, what's it? So that I would know, but it's chesterresidents.org. They have tons of information on there, and
Berks is a very, very conservative county.
Yeah, right. Other questions? Go ahead.
So talking about methodologies, I guess, or sabotage or whatever might be effective, are there any ways you can conceive of how to sort of make the titans fight each other, in the sense that it's almost like, insurance companies are evil and the oil companies are evil, but the oil companies need to be insured. So if you keep doing something, then eventually the insurance companies want their money, so they'll have to keep raising the rates, or, I don't know if that's a good example, but you know what I mean? Like, are there any examples we can think of how to make the capitalist agents fight each other in this battle for a better world, or I don't know. I don't know, but I just wonder if you have any ideas on something like that.
I have some information. The insurance companies, especially ones that are involved in property insurance, are very interested in reducing climate change pressures because it costs them a fortune between fires and flood.
Right.
So they, in that limited way, can often be interested in some of the things we're interested in.
Absolutely.
Cool, okay.
I think that's right. I think that question is being anticipated by the very actors right now, right? So this is why Brian Deese is heading the NBC, former BlackRock executive, right? because they're looking for ways to de-risk, there's all of these different noxious sectors, and to, keep them humming along as is possible before they collapse. And this is the oil and gas piece of it, I think, is harder to think through for me, but the real estate piece is very obvious, because especially in states like Texas and Florida, where there's no income tax and state and local budgets are floated almost entirely through property tax receipts, every incentive for them is to just continue building luxury real estate development, and for them that means doing a lot of amenities, and for them that amenity is the waterfront, the ocean. And to the extent that they're building any climate adaptation infrastructure, they're doing it through things that are called TIFs, which are just different ways of basically trying to capture the excess value of real estate developers' week of luxury real estate development, and put it into seawalls, flood barriers, other things in front of that luxury real estate development and nowhere else. We're going to see a version of this in Manhattan when whatever is built was the Big U, then was the Lower East Side Resiliency Project, and now is basically just a big dumb wall around the lower 2 miles or so of the region. It'll cover some of the Lower East Side, which is good, and also protect the nature for obvious reasons. And so the question of how we peel those people away from each other is the right one. I don't know what the answer is. I do think there's not a path forward to internationalist Green New Deal type infrastructures without peeling 1 or 2 green capitalists away. I don't know who those people are, but we probably have to find a way to peel them off and to then crush the other folks you're talking about. I don't know that the insurance industry and the oil and gas industry are winnable for us. And even if they're not winnable, I don't know what the wedge is to get them to fight each other, although I don't see that. I say that because I think, you're talking about what are the components of, I don't know, sort of talking around what are the components of energy democracy or energy justice or whatever we want to call this. And many things, one of those is probably a microgrid distributed and controlled by people who are served by it. And to come back for just a moment on that topic to I think Emma's point earlier around linking decarceration and climate justice, one of the only parts of the US where we have grids like that is around prisons. So every US operated, or prison operated facility built from 1982 or so onward has to have enough capacity on its site to power or generate, store, and transmit enough power to keep its facility running in the event of a regional blackout. And one of the things that's come out of this work I sort of mentioned earlier in Appalachia was thinking through not just the decommissioning, decarceration facility like Big Sandy, but seizing that grid, that on-site generation, storage, transmission capacity, and converting it to a rural electric co-op, and thinking through that as a way to pool electricity, pool land, pool other things out of commodity markets, put them in a cooperative ownership. And you think about that in Appalachia too, almost all those prisons built at the top abandoned mines, which are usually mountaintop renewable sites. They're the flattest and highest sites in Appalachia, so the best ones for also installing new solar and wind power. Those to me seem if we're thinking about the merger of local solutions we've been talking about, and what these wedges are that can at least raise the conversation between those that not actually fit each other. Those are sites to me that actually are as important, if not more so, than some of the pipeline corridor fights, some of the oil and gas facility fights like the ES refinery, which is headed towards a very bleak future as well. So anyway, that's not really good to your question, but that's those are the things that's kind of raising for me, and I think it's a really important question that we want to spend some more time.
Scandinavian as renewable energy have made some limited investments in certain cities, like New York, which return and so on. And I've been trying to figure out why it is that the Democratic majority in New York and still liberal climate denial not passing the Renewable Act, which leaves the opening for these sort of other private interests and these Norwegian and other companies to come in. And so my question is, do you think that is the future of green capitalism in some of these bigger liberal cities? And why is it that is do come out, part of the market in the corner. In these places where we do have these other alternatives.
Yeah, okay. Great question, and I think I'll try and also answer your question while tackling the issue. So yeah, you're right. Danish wind turbine companies have been winning a lot of the contracts that have been tendered to build offshore massive wind facilities off the coast of New York and other states like Massachusetts. That has partially to do with a history of technology, right? So, U.S. wind manufacturers, turbine manufacturers type to use technology based on helicopters coming out of the military industrial complex in the United States. It didn't work so well. The big manufacturers in Denmark were all initially tractor manufacturers, and it turns out that kind of infrastructure actually works much better. And so, they got kind of infrastructural lead. But it's not just about technology, it's also about the fact that in Denmark and in Germany, the state gave really serious subvention for the development of community-powered collectives that would buy into wind power and put up a lot of these wind turbines. So they were able to develop at scale, but with local forms of energy democracy, and that makes them outcompete companies that don't have that experience, both in terms of developing technology and in terms of sort of deploying it, and that kind of market dominance. So in America, that gets read, since we live in a right-wing utopia, as well, they're just better at competing. It's the free market, and they're giving us the lowest bid. It ignores a much kind of bigger history and a history of democracy being able to use the state to transform people's lives and to facilitate energy transition. And that comes back to your question of pitting different factions of capital against one another, right? Because one could argue that there's a kind of war going on between the fossil capitalist sector and the kind of green energy sector. Not that they're totally antithetical, of course, Shell and BP and all these other companies have their sort of green investment units, but there's a big difference between Exxon and Tesla, or GM and Tesla. So we can kind of see some tensions there. But the reason that renewable energy is doing as well as it is because of those state investments in Northern Europe, which helped to make the technology attractive and led to massive state investment in China, which led to very cheap solar technology, right? And so now solar outcompetes coal and nuclear in the United States. So you get all these pundits saying, oh, well, we're going to have energy transition because renewable energy is just cheaper. Why is that? Well, it's because of this history. So again, it shows the importance of fighting for energy democracy and making whatever incursions we can into the state, essentially. So how does that come back to your question? How might that play out in a local context? Well, I think we need to think about not just energy democracy and environmental justice, but racial and class justice, and there are groups doing that. Like, for instance, the environmental justice organization Uprose, which is based in Brooklyn, has been fighting for a wind turbine assembly facility on the waterfront there, which could mean that communities who have engaged, historically in industry don't just get dismantled and get another big skyscraper for the yuppies put up, but you get people who get to keep staying in their community, who get a good source of employment and can actually construct those wind turbines. And so we need the state subsidies essentially to make that possible. We need state procurement policies to make that happen. And if that kind of question is a real burning question in communities in New York City, it's such a large question in the Global South, right? What is Global South renewable energy technology going to look like? Is it all going to be shipped from the United States or from another developed place with the kind of scenario that you were talking about, Billy, kind of competition for market gain by wealthy countries, or are people of Global South nations going to really benefit economically from the transition? So these questions really have to be thought out, and I think they come down to sort of political power at the end of the day. So we need mass movements around energy transition, essentially.
I'm old enough to have lived through the gas crisis and the subsequent rise in renewable energy in the 70s. And one of the lessons that certainly we ought to remember from that period is that one of the things that happened is that the oil companies bought up the solar companies and technologies and bought patents on and tips. And we need to be aware of that. And I'd just like to also respond to the stuff about sabotage. One of the things we have to be strategizing about is that fossil fuel companies are going to commit sabotage. They're going to, anytime they're going to get threatened, they're going to create gas crises, they're going to create a power grid failing, and we need to be talking about that so that when it happens, it doesn't come as a surprise.
They've already been doing that the whole
Yep.
time.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to respond, I guess something that just came up for me is, I think it's also important to note that the renewable energy transition is not inherently just, it's actually extremely extractive in order to make lithium-ion batteries. We need to mine lithium, typically done in Chile, in indigenous communities. It takes billions, many tons of water to mine lithium. It destroys the environment. It's very much extractive, very much similar to fossil fuel extraction. Big green renewable energy companies are not any better than oil companies, except for the fact that maybe they're not causing climate change, maybe they're not emitting CO2, but they're still engaging in green colonialism. And so I think it's really important to note that, maybe Tesla is creating better cars, but for who and at what cost? Rare earth minerals are mined in the global south. These communities are destroyed, and it's something that needs to be reckoned with and thought about a lot, because renewable energy is almost just as bad as fossil fuels in many ways.
I mean, it sort of follows on what I've been thinking about, to quote you, having been around 70 years and seeing how adaptive and flexible capitalism is. And they seem to be able to co-opt almost anything. It's a feature. And I think that makes the idea of energy democracy so important, because we're a little closer to the edge than I think that capitalism has ever come. But I have no doubt that somebody's going to figure out how to make a shitload of money out of making non-fossil fuel, non-CO2 emitting energy, and we're just going to go happily along unless we do something to get the trolley on a different track. Because maybe I would like that if we don't die of CO2, but it's not good enough. But I have a lot of faith in capitalism being able to do that. Just seem to do it over and over and over.
And Saudis are moving towards, Saudis will probably take a lot of, they have the capital and they're moving towards the green, they're moving towards certain things that I'm sure they're not going to do justly, but they're going to appear to be to be on the cutting edge of it. I don't know if it was money, but I can't see what they're doing.
We have one more question, probably one more question. You go ahead.
Oh, it's not really a question, it's just sort of adding on to this line of thought that everybody's been talking. I'm really glad I wanted to throw out the question with you, and also as everybody's comments about this is a world system, a global, capitalism is a world system, it's a global system that also requires an internationalist and global perspective in order to be rooted. So it's also needing to think across these local state scale struggles and how it's also, can't be separated from what's happening. Let's say, you mentioned Chile, I'm also thinking Bolivia, where lithium is mined. And one of the contradictions, is that, sometimes you might have Bolivia itself, and Evo Morales, moving the more socialismo, it's premised, like, the development model is also about mining lithium. And that actually, process isn't too much different from what it might look like if it's state-led, but if it's like not too much different from like an extractive multinational company who's also extracting. So there's also those kinds of contradictions that we encounter when we don't. Like, I'm just thinking of just like in a classic Marxist sense, like what Marx says in Capital, like one way to like get the trolley on the track is to expropriate the expropriators. And so like, where is that? Like, I'm just thinking of Andrea's mom kind of in that way, you know, like I just think we have to keep in mind today, it just seems like Black and Indigenous insurgency is constantly moving us, like, to keep that within the toolkit, because I think you're totally right that the state won't relent unless, I just think there has to be space. We just can't flirt with adventurism and romanticize it. It just has to be thought about. And so I just kind of wanted to add that onto it because I think that the questions of like Indigenous insurgency in the South, or the global South, has kind of contains ecological sort of, you know, elements as well. And so I'm just thinking of like the environmentalisms of the core, in which there are forms of direct action that aren't seen as ecological. When it's about like, you know, expropriators, which is itself actually, you know, ecological. It can't be separated from ecological. So there is like, what are the movements that aren't ecological that we don't think of as environmental that actually are? And so I just feel like that is, I was hearing everybody's comments, it's just like, what extent do we engage with the state, or what extent do we like, you know, rise up and demand and take it, you know, seize the new profession. It's not ask the legislators to do it for us. You have to, so where is that ecological struggle? I just feel like we're always reminded of that. And when I saw like, you know, recent farming, I just couldn't stop thinking about those kind of things. It's not ecological, you know, immediately, but it does have just like the just can't be seen separate from what it's talking about. So anyways, that's all I wanted to say, but
Yeah, no, that's it. I think that's a really excellent point, given that we definitely emphasize the context of international culture, and the U.S. military is for the own climate, and militarization goes hand in hand with environmental destruction and devastation all over the globe. So we have to be internationalists. We want to questions of justice and liberation that don't just land here in the United States, which is, you know, an imperial settler colony. So important to remember that. But good to close out, I think, on that note. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
I'll go home and cry.
We have girls around
Organized.
Yeah.